Why are fictional empires always evil? And have you noticed that fictional empires always end up feeling like some Clone War mashup of Star Wars and the sodding Roman Empire? But they don't have to. You can avoid that with clever world building, and I'm going to show you how, by pulling from history you might not even know about. To be fair, it's hard not to think of Star Wars when we're talking about evil empires. It's a world building project that's never really left the public consciousness for almost 50 years. I regret to inform you the math checks out. You may now crumble into dust. My apologies. One of the reasons it's so ubiquitous as an empire is the excellent branding. The Galactic Empire is visually coded as evil. The starched grey and black uniforms with painful collars, the rigid symmetry, the overwhelming scale of everything from Star Destroyers to Coruscant, a planet-sized metropolis. Technically it's called a Ecumenopolis, by the way. And this vibes with us because it's the ultimate expression of joyless uniformity, a theft of individualism and freedom that everyone who's ever worked in a corporate office can get behind and hate. It's not just evil, it's a very familiar kind of evil. The rebels, on the other hand, are scrappy, diverse, and highly individualistic. They wear natural fibers and earth tones, guys. One of them is a mostly naked Sasquatch. These space hippies are clearly the good guys, right? And even more than these epic visuals, there's another reason Star Wars became such a popular franchise, and the evil empire such an iconic, all-eclipsing example. It's because you, modern viewer, are culturally coded to root for rebels. Why? Well, the 18th and 19th century saw a rise in popular individualism following the Enlightenment. We see this change in artists who shifted from guild-trained craftspeople to individual geniuses. The era also brought a greater desire for personal freedoms. People began to prize self-expression and self-realization over community and conformity. So given all that, it's only natural that we root for the individualistic rebels over the corporate conglomerate, right? Well, there's another piece of the puzzle. Because, you will recall, there were several revolutions and rebellions in the 18th and 19th century. Well, one of them became an origin story for the United States, and a source of political rhetoric and identity even until today. And then it spread as popular mythology through Hollywood and the world. If you check, and I did, there's been a significant and consistent rise in the glorification of fictional rebels since the rise of Hollywood. Because that's how scrappy rebels fighting an overwhelmingly powerful empire became an irresistible underdog narrative and a cultural default. So the rebels are the good guys, and that's why the empire is evil, right? Well, actually, the rebels aren't always the good guys. Take classic tales like The Scarlet Pimpernel and A Tale of Two Cities, where the French Revolution is portrayed as a force of destructive chaos. And of course, plenty of modern sci-fi and fantasy covers this ground. Sometimes that's a direct homage to those novels, like Scarlet by Genevieve Cogman or Heartless Hunter by Kristen Ciccarelli. Other times, it's just riffing on the idea that the resistance is rarely smooth and often bloody. So what happens when the rebels are the bad guys? Well, usually it means the theme of the work is order versus chaos. Because even the most well-intentioned rebels end up overthrowing the status quo. And most rebellions, they tend to be violent and bloody. Another setup where rebels are presented as the bad guys is when the audience, or the world, believes in what's called the divine right to rule. It's a very medieval concept, but you can also see it in fantasy worlds. That peasant uprising is great until you realise that the literal gods put the king on the throne. Suddenly crop light, divine misadventure, problems all round. And in those fantasy settings where gods literally walk the earth and smite up close in real time, well, killing the divinely appointed emperor definitely hits differently. It might be an apocalyptic mistake. So if rebels are sometimes the good guys and sometimes the bad guys, does that mean that empires can sometimes be the good guys too? Well, no, not really. And here's why. Empires can't be morally good, but they can be morally interesting. Why? Well, first of all, there's a lack of consent. Generally, people aren't asking to be ruled by someone else, especially not some rando from a foreign lando. There also tends to be an unequal power structure between the rulers and the ruled. For example, Roman cities had different taxes depending on their relationship to the empire. These are definitely not free and equal spaces. And most importantly, empires are, by their nature, extractive. That means they take stuff. Sometimes that's limited to tribute and taxes, sometimes it's full-out strip mining, and sometimes it's literally stealing your firstborn child, like a Disney villain or the Ottoman Empire. A lot of empires were conversionist. They deliberately enforced their own beliefs and culture on their colonies, and sometimes actively tried to eradicate indigenous ones. But there were empires which gave individual protections and freedoms, at least to certain groups. They gave religious autonomy, gave full cultural autonomy, and even allowed conquered lands to continue to govern themselves internally. Take, for example, the Achaemenid Empire. When they heard a Jewish settlement in their territory wasn't celebrating Passover the traditional way, they got worried. They sent a stern letter. It was serious. But this wasn't about conversion. At the time, the Achaemenid Empire believed each people and each place had their own gods. If they weren't worshipped properly, the world could literally fall apart. So the Achaemenid non-Jewish empire was worried that the Jews weren't being Jewish enough. The stern letter effectively said, "Jew better. I'm so sorry. That was terrible. I'll show myself out." So now you know a bit about the options, how do you actually world build an empire, evil or otherwise? Well, I recommend starting with how the empire sees themselves. That's useful whether or not you have characters inside it. As with any organisation, you need to ask what are their internal morals and values. No empire sets out to be evil. So doing evil is probably off the table as a motivation for building an empire. However condescending or misguided, they believe what they're doing is right, for some reason. But you get to choose what that justification is. It might be glory, God's will, or something more pragmatic, like securing resources and territory. Maybe they keep seizing lands because they keep getting attacked. As we discussed with theme, perhaps they secure order and peace at all costs. And once you understand their motivations, consider how they present those to the world. Think motto, insignia, uniforms, and they don't have to be grey. The Mughal Empire and the British Empire had brightly coloured regalia, good for shock and awe and a sense of wealth. And of course, how do they act? Perhaps they present as missionaries with a duty to enforce morals and spread their religion. Or they see themselves as a civilizing movement, creating schools to share their particular ideas about education and culture. Alexander the Great famously freed cities from Persian rule, only to snack them for his own Macedonian empire. Or they might actively preserve local cultures, religion, and internal laws, like the Achaemenid Empire. Once you've figured out why your empire is empiring, it'll be easier to plan everyday life in the colonies and provinces. What protections and freedoms do people get? Also, which people get those protections and freedom? In the Ottoman Empire, citizens were divided by religion, and their rights were given accordingly. It didn't matter where you were from or what colour your skin was. Ancient Athens, a so-called democratic empire, had 4 different classes of citizens with different rights. And it had non-citizens, including foreigners, women and slaves, who had little to no legal protection at all. Hooray! Other empires, especially fictional ones, might classify their citizens in different ways and accord different rights. Mages in Dragon Age are highly controlled and restricted. In the Murderbot series, constructs don't have any legal rights or autonomy, at least in the Corporation Rim. This is a great way to dig into the specifics of your world and make your empires more integrated and unique, not just another Star Wars knockoff. In order to do that, you'll need to know what's exciting about your world, and World Anvil will help you refine that vision. Look at your different fantasy species, the religions you've crafted, and even the unique rules of your world, and figure out how your empire will react to them, and take advantage of them. And remember, your empire will have diplomatic relationships with its territories and provinces, from adoration to all-out rebellion. Use diplomacy webs to keep track of all that and make sure that you're up to date with who hates whom. And you can track the history of your empire from its humble beginnings to its glorious evil zenith. All this world building is going to strengthen your empire, and vice versa, building a richer space for all kinds of storytelling. But being part of an empire isn't all bad, because just like a Costco card, you get some member benefits. As we discussed, empires are inherently morally dubious because of consent and power issues, and some were really evil, but there can be good things too. For a start, you had a big guy looking out for you. Many empires would garrison and guard the borders of their lands, preventing raids from bandits and aggressive neighbours. And old enemies became part of the same big club as the empire expanded, which did tend to bring peace and stability, of a kind, to various regions. Empires also tend to be really good at logistics and infrastructure. Think roads, standardised currency, new bridges and aqueducts, even a postal service. Many brought in advanced irrigation techniques. Again, like the Achaemenids. Kind of love those guys. And there are some instances where the new empire was morally better than an older system. Again, the Achaemenid Empire banned slavery, which is a pretty good plus. But of course, at what cost do these benefits come in your world? Because there's usually at least some kind of tax or levy in an empire. Think of it like a protection racket. We protect you from the big bandits and raiders with our scary army, and you pay us to keep that army well fed and supplied. And if it just so happens that the big scary army could also be used against you, well, just be a good imperial citizen and you probably have nothing to worry about. Right? Of course, taxes might be unsupportable or change over time. Maybe imperial tax collectors don't account for crop failures, or you end up paying for a war halfway across the globe against people you personally don't have anything against. And the bigger an empire gets, the more resources it takes to sustain it. And some empires could only survive from constant expansion. Speaking of costs, sometimes cultural or religious conversion was the aim of an empire, especially those who view themselves as a civilizing force, like the Roman and British empires. In those cases, the cost of the empire might be your history and language, your culture, your faith, or your very way of life. It might be your people's entire distinct identity. And it's hard to put a price on that. So why are empires evil in fiction? Well, partly because modern audiences are primed to distrust power and root for rebels. They're grey because conformity is the opposite of individualism, which is usually part of the theme of empires versus rebels. If, in your world building, you paint an empire as wholly benevolent and selfless, then I have serious questions about your setting. But you can use these levers, the motivation of your empire, the benefits and freedoms they give, as well as what costs they extract, to create different kinds of empires. Ones that aren't just a clone of the Roman Empire or of Star Wars. And flavour them to the nines. Give them distinct and fascinating cultures, decadent uniforms, and deeply historic or mythic origins. That's how you world build an empire that's memorable and impactful and deeply entrenched in your world building. So if you already have an evil empire in your world, I have a great opportunity for you to leverage it in your next plot with the Cobra effect. This cunning paradigm is an infinitely satisfying way to help your rebels get one over on the man. And tell me about your evil empire in the comments, the ones you've built already or the ones you're going to. Please like this video while you're down there, and I'll see you in the next one. In the meantime, grab your hammer and go world build.